listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Radio's authority on the world of the paranormal and the science of parapsychology, celebrating 25 years of broadcasting around the world and to the great beyond.
The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Gwilda Wiyaka's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the Science of Magic or endorsed in any manner by Gwilda Wiyaka, Relmar McConnell Media Company, its affiliated networks, stations, or employees. Welcome to the Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, a program dedicated to uncovering the unified nature of reality and humanity's ever-evolving place as truly galactic beings. For more information on the Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit us online at www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Welcome to the Science of Magic, a place where science and magic come together to transform fact into evolving truth. We can be found on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. This hour we'll be exploring I'll Never Be the Same. It's a sad fact that trauma is unavoidable in this physical world. From childhood bumps and bruises to the horror of child abuse, no one grows up totally unscathed. Even a well-meaning but overprotective parent can create trauma through rigid control of their children. The anatomy of trauma is complex. Trauma can originate at any level of our being, physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual. While at first glance it may appear that physical trauma should disappear once the physical damage has healed, it's not so simple. Trauma can be initiated at any level, but it also impacts all four levels regardless of origin. To fully recover, we must treat all four. In a simplistic example, a small child is playing in the backyard under the watchful eye of a doting parent. She knows mom's right there and thus feels safe to explore the fascinating environment. A brightly colored bumblebee lands on a dandelion in front of the child where she sits in the grass. Intrigued, the child plucks the bee off the flower to examine it more closely. Fearing for its life, the bee naturally stings the child to secure its release. Child cries, mom comforts the child and treats the sting. No allergic reaction follows, and the child settles down to play again. So all is well, right? Wrong. On the physical level, the body remembers the trauma long after it's healed. In the future, the sight of a bumblebee will trigger an adrenal fear response. Bee senses the fear, registers it as aggression, and is triggered into stinging. On the emotional level, simply seeing the color yellow may trigger avoidance. This is the origin of many phobias. On the mental level, the traumatic event may be compartmentalized to reduce the trauma, leaving the child with no memory of the incident. A reframing also takes place. What the child used to see as safe, the backyard with her mother watching over her, is now considered dangerous and untrustworthy. On the spiritual or quantum level, the child has disconnected from the frequency of safety. This creates a polarity reversal in the push-pull of her personal field. The frequency of safety generates safety, while the frequency of danger creates danger. This is a spiritual illness referred to as soul loss in shamanic practices. It is fascinating how specifically polarity reversal expresses in a person's life. In this particular scenario, it could result in someone who is stung by bees well more than the average person. They would be prone to mishap no matter how carefully guarded by the parent. They would lose their trust of nature and not feel safe in their own backyard. Due to mental compartmentalization, they'd have no memory of the event. They must thus decide that this is just the way life is. Yellow is an ugly color, the world is not safe, and they're accident-prone, and they cannot trust anyone to protect them. Life would go on, but they would never be the same. This is the complex anatomy of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Indigenous people understood trauma is unavoidable and treated it on all 4 levels as soon as possible. The wisdom behind this practice is that trauma begets trauma. The longer we carry the damage, the more we become re-injured by drawing in the same or similar events. Soon it snowballs, and if the trauma was severe, we're eventually so impaired our life becomes dysfunctional. In indigenous cultures, shamans were available to treat spiritual illness as well as the physical, emotional, and mental components. Modern culture has been without shamanic healing for generations, and our modalities have become extremely compartmentalized. The doctor treats the physical. If the emotional upset continues, a therapist is recommended. On the mental level, an informed person might know to seek out a hypnotherapist or an EMDR specialist to help with decompartmentalization and reframing. However, the quantum level will likely remain untreated, and the same patterns will persist, causing further damage. Our guest this hour, Michele Rosenthal, is an award-winning PTSD blogger, best-selling, and a nominated author, founder of HealMyPTSD.com. A former faculty member of a clinical development institute, Michele is also a trauma survivor who struggled with PTSD for over 25 years. She launched a successful healing rampage and has been free of PTSD symptoms for almost a decade. Her most recent book is Heal Your PTSD, Dynamic Strategies That Work. I'll introduce Michele, and together we'll explore the magic and the science of recovering from trauma. You're listening to The Science of Magic. Prior innovative episodes can always be found on our website, www.thescienceofmat.net. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Afterlife expert Roberta Grimes was the first one to say that dying can be fun. Now her best-selling book, The Fun of Dying, is available in stores worldwide. So if you wonder whether death ends life, how it feels to die, or what heaven might be like, The Fun of Dying was written for you. And if you have always been afraid of death, or if you worry that your life has no meaning, let The Fun of Dying ease your fears and bring new meaning to your life. Nothing said in The Fun of Dying is based on the teachings of any religion. Instead, Roberta draws on evidence to explain how death happens, how it feels, and what comes next. A lot of the best death-related evidence was produced in the first half of the 20th century. When it is put together with recent discoveries, it tells a consistent and amazing story. Roberta Grimes blogs and answers questions at robertagrimes.com. Her wonderful book, The Fun of Dying, is available on Amazon and at stores worldwide wherever books are sold. You're listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net.
While science pursues fact, magic accesses the quantum level, bridging random facts to form truth. As long as science and magic remain separate and polarized, the truth cannot be known. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka. Join me on the Science of Magic radio program dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. During each episode, I'll be speaking with experienced and respected scientists and mystics. From astrologers to astronomers, from medical doctors to shaman, the scientific method to dowsing and intuition, we will weave together information from seemingly divergent practices to promote unity and enlightenment. Join me, Gwilda Wiyaka, and the Science of Magic right here on the X Zone Broadcast Network. For more information, visit www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Starr began to demonstrate a metaphysical connection to the spirit world as a little girl. Her family noticed the connection, but it was a great-grandmother who told the family that Linnea was indeed gifted. The great-grandmother, who was also gifted, felt that Linnea had indeed inherited these attributes. It has been noticed that oftentimes such things are passed down through the generations. Linnea was also born with a caul, a thin white membrane across a newborn's face. Legend has it that if the baby is born with this caul, the child will have second sight, or what we call psychic abilities. Linnea Starr does past, present, and future, and has the gift of prophecy. It is written within scriptures that if you are able to give factual information, and prophecies indeed come true, the gift indeed comes from the divine realm. Linnea Starr does large interactive groups as well as private gatherings. For more information on Linnea Starr or to contact Linnea for a one-on-one consultation, visit her website at www.linneastar.com. That's www.linneastar.com.
Welcome back. This is the Science of Magic, dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our guest this hour, Michele Rosenthal, author of Heal Your PTSD, Dynamic Strategies at Work. Her website is www.healmyptsd.com. Michele, thank you so much for joining us on the Science of Magic.
Thank you so much for having me, Gwilda. I'm delighted to be here.
You struggled with PTSD for over 25 years. What triggered your PTSD experience?
A childhood trauma, which was related to a near-death situation created by a medical mistake. And I was in the hospital for a month, and when I came out of there, I'd had this literally a near-death experience and gone out of my body and come back and survived a really horrific weeks on end in the hospital. An allergic reaction essentially turned me into a full-body burn victim. And I lost 100% of my skin over a series of weeks in the hospital at a time in 1981 when I was just a 13-year-old kid, and nobody had ever seen what was happening to me. So I was in this special hospital in New York City that no doctor had ever seen what was going on, so there was very little that they could do except stand and watch what was happening. And when I came out of the hospital, I knew I was going to make a full physical recovery. The scars that I still have today wouldn't stop me from living a regular, normal life. But I was so clear, Gwilda, that I was not the same girl who had gone into the hospital. And when you think back to when you were 13, what kind of coping skills do we even have as kids for major trauma?
Right, we really don't.
We really don't, right? And I thought your introduction was so poignant in the story that you told and the different levels and the different ways that trauma affects us. so much because as kids, we don't have a way to process. We don't even know who we are, so we don't have any philosophies or beliefs for how to take in a huge trauma that creates that lack of safety, that instills that deep fear, and then what do we do after that? And at the time, in 1981, post-traumatic stress disorder was only a year old in terms of being a clinical diagnostic entity, and it was only being applied to veterans coming home from Vietnam. Literally, it originated, it's a concept that goes back for millennia, but the actual diagnostic entity was created out of the support groups of Vietnam survivors. So nobody was looking at a civilian kid with a medical trauma and applying those ideas to what I was struggling with. So I went undiagnosed for a very long time, and as I'm sure you've seen with other people, when we survive trauma, we put in place belief systems and coping mechanisms so that we can continue to move forward in life. But they're not all healthy, and they certainly don't all create a good lifestyle.
Yeah, and they tend to go on default, and we never re-examine them because we're compartmentalized, and without help, you're definitely, you've taken stuff offline that used to be used for something in your life that was productive to create these defense mechanisms to protect you from your fears. Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And you're so right. I mean, that you've used the word that I so often use. You live by default. You don't initiate or choose anything. Everything is a reaction versus a response to what's happening, and you just deal with everything as if it's incoming because you feel so powerless. Essentially, post-traumatic stress disorder and a lot of post-trauma reactions are at their core a sense of helpless, powerless vulnerability. And until you heal that core sensation, it's very hard to change any of the other coping mechanisms that you put in place.
Right. Do you believe we all have PTSD to one degree or another, Michele?
No, I don't.
So just people that have had a severe trauma.
Well, and not everybody. Let's put it into perspective with some statistics. Essentially, up to 80% of all adults will have some kind of major trauma in their lifetime, but only 20% of those will end up with post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD literally has 4 specific criteria. Outside of those criteria, we're all affected by trauma. So if that's what you're saying, absolutely, there's no life that's not touched by trauma, and we all respond to it in varying ways. But PTSD is a very specific psychological, neurophysiological response that interferes with a person's ability to live. I'll just put it in that basic terminology. And that's not the process that a lot of people have in response to trauma. Someone was just telling me a statistic out of Israel, which lives in a very high stress, war-ridden state, and I think they have like a 1% PTSD rate. So it's very interesting from a cultural perspective. In the United States, up to 40% of our military is coming back from the Middle East with PTSD. What's the difference between the cultures, between the way we're raised, between our entire process of looking at mental health in the American military system, for example? There's a big stigma against mental health. And I don't know enough about what goes on in Israel to promote the differences, but just from those statistics alone, you can see that there are a lot of people who go through trauma but do not end up with PTSD, and that's a really important point I feel to make, because we don't want this conversation to make everyone feel like they're all walking around with a clinical psychological issue, because most people come through trauma and they don't have that experience of PTSD.
Great. So what are the physical impacts of PTSD?
Well, there are so many. So let's break them down into the literal physical chemical changes and also the brain changes. And actually, I'm going to start with the brain changes. We see, and there are many, but I'll break them down into some of the most interesting and the most identifiable in terms of how they impact the way we behave. So, for example, the amygdala is our fear center. That's the part of the brain, it's this little almond-shaped part of your brain that constantly scans your environment for danger. After a trauma, and with people with PTSD, what we see is this gets taken to a heightened extreme. The amygdala overfires. so much so that it sees threat everywhere. In studies, we've actually seen that the amygdala expands in shape. It overworks. If you think of a muscle, like when you go to the gym and you overwork a muscle, it gets bigger. The amygdala actually expands in shape. It starts working so hard. And that keeps us on constant alert. One of the real problems with post-traumatic stress disorder is that we get stuck in survival mode, and the amygdala is a large part of that. You survive because you notice threat, but the part of the problem is we get stuck in this survival loop. The brain never recognizes the trauma is over, and I can relax. We naturally go into rest and repair versus activated response constantly. It's a symbiotic back and forth relationship that our body naturally knows how to do. With post-traumatic stress disorder, we get stuck in this activated response mode, and the amygdala continues to overfire, and it becomes a sort of feedback loop. We can't relax and come down because the amygdala keeps going. Conversely, a part of the reason that happens is the hippocampus, a part of the brain that is, its whole job is to consolidate and process memory. Literally, it is the taskmaster for moving short-term memory into long-term storage. That small action is the difference between feeling like something's happening right now and something happened 5 years ago. When that hippocampus is hijacked by trauma, literally, with trauma we see an increase in hormones that are related to stress. So, for example, cortisol shoots up. High cortisol interrupts how the hippocampus functions, and when it can't fully function, then it's not consolidating those memories, which means we come through a trauma and we still feel like it's happening now. And that can be a full conscious response or even a subconscious constant fear and feeling of danger. So with those two basic changes happening in the brain, what happens is we shift into this lifestyle of constant survival mode. First of all, it's exhausting and fatiguing. A lot of PTSD survivors experience adrenal fatigue because we are just so constantly revved up all the time. All of that creates a psychological response of darkness, despair, nightmares that happen which make you exhausted. These things all pull together and can cause literal physical aches and pains, things like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. So I'll stop there. You ask one question, you get all of these different answers, but I wanted to sort of just position this as how physical this psychological response to trauma actually becomes, and how the psychological response is so intertwined with the neurophysiological response. So it's both of them together create an ultimate change in lifestyle, both from how we approach living, but also how we physically experience it.
So we're in fight or flight all the time, and I would imagine that that's not only exhausting, but fight or flight, as I recall, shuts down the digestive system so that you can use your energy to run or fight. So do you see also digestive disorders coming from this?
Many, many digestive disorders, absolutely. And you know, in addition to that, I mean, it doesn't, when we're in pure fight or flight mode, like we actually are in the moment of trauma and we have to get out, then yes, the reproductive system shuts down, the digestive shuts down, everything that's not essential to survival in that moment. What we see later is that there's an enormous gut sensitivity. A lot of survivors often have an upset stomach, they have trouble digesting things, and I think a lot of that has to do with fight or flight, in addition to the whole idea of, you know, your gut is connected to your emotional brain. So when you are unhappy or frightened, all of those negative feelings show up in your gut. I mean, even if we just think about it, so many people have a fear of public speaking. And what happens? They throw up, they get butterflies in their stomach, they have to run to the bathroom. So even before PTSD, we have so many examples of how the emotional brain impacts the digestive system. And then you're right, Gwilda, you add PTSD to that, and it can really extend those effects.
Well, we're going to have to take a short break. This is absolutely fascinating. On the other side of our break, we'll come and talk about what we can do if we find ourselves in this condition. We'll return to our discussion after this short break. You're listening to The Science of Magic. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Do you want to hear more? Previous broadcasts of innovative episodes can always be found on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Wouldn't you love to know the secret to everything? Well then, meet Dr. Kimberly McGeorge and her cutting-edge breakthrough knowledge that combines science with possibility. Dr. Kimberly brings real-life answers and healing to those open to alternative solutions. She teaches solution-based programs and classes that will change all areas of your life forever. Specializing in conscious creation, intuitive readings, and energy medicine, you can rapidly shift health, relationships, business, and money and abundance challenges quickly. Receive her best-selling book, Secret to Everything, at no cost by going to secrettoeverything.com/X-Zone. That's right, transformation can start now. Just go to secrettoeverything.com/X-Zone and receive Dr. Kimberly's book for free.
You're listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. Thomas Jefferson was a Burgess of 27 when he met Martha Wales Skelton, a 22-year-old widowed heiress who was fondly called Patty by her family. They were married on January the 1st, 1772, and they took up residence in a cabin on the building site on top of a Virginia mountain that Thomas had named Monticello. As Thomas and Patty slowly built their first version of the great house at Monticello, the Revolutionary War was heating up. Patty, with difficulty, bore 5 children, but only 2 girls survived. Thomas's political career developed to the point where he was often away from home, but after he authored and signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, he resolved never again to leave his wife. He was elected the governor of Virginia, just as that state became the Revolution's last battleground. The Revolutionary War ended in 1781, and Thomas gladly retired altogether to my family, my farm, and my books. But Patty continued to want to bear her treasured husband a son, and late in the summer of 1782, she died of kidney failure at the age of 33, 4 months after having borne yet another girl. Thomas was so devastated by her death that he never remarried. He mourned her for the rest of his life, even as he helped to frame the peace in France and then became the first Secretary of State, the second Vice President, and the third President of the United States. This story is true. Thomas Jefferson was such an obsessive letter writer and record keeper that we know where he was and what he was doing nearly every day of his adult life. Every significant thing he says in My Thomas comes from his contemporary writings. My Thomas by Roberta Grimes is now available at Barnes & Noble, Costco, Target, Books A Million, Hudson Booksellers, Kmart, Walmart, Sam's Club, Walgreens, CVS, and online at Amazon.com. You can visit Roberta Grimes online at www.robertagrimes.com.
The scientist and the mystic have been on an age-old, relentless search with one thing in common. They seek truth. Their paths converge in the 40,000-year-old practice of shamanism, an ancient science delving to the quantum level of life, facilitating healing, manifestation, and evolution. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka. the founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Arts School, a unique Colorado State certified occupational school training shamanic practitioners and teachers. We also provide classes for empowering personal lives through shamanism. Our certification classes are in week-long segments enabling international participation, and online classes and long-distance shamanic healing sessions are available. Come discover the science of magic in the limitless world of shamanism. www.findyourpathhome.com.
Unwilling to be the government's deadly assassin, gifted psychic Kahara Mitchell went AWOL and ended up buried under rubble in the wake of a great tsunami. She regained consciousness far from Earth on the medical ship of a Daguerrean intergalactic fleet. Has she been rescued or abducted by aliens? The Chalice of Carrie, Kahira O'Donnell's latest paranormal science fiction romance, is the passionate story of an Earth woman and her destined mates, twin kings from another galaxy. Kahara uses her gifts fighting alongside Lords Rom and Ra in a war that will determine the destiny of galaxies. The Chalice of Carrie by Kahira O'Donnell is now available at KahiraO'Donnell.com or at Amazon.com. You're listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. What happened in Benghazi is revealed by Nicholas Genix, author of Obama, Islam, and Benghazi. He informs the American people that President Obama deceived them by advocating a strong foreign policy prior to the 2012 presidential election, and Hillary Clinton supported this deception. As the title infers, there is a connection between Obama, Islam, and Benghazi. Ample evidence informs Americans that Obama's early indoctrination in the Quran developed an affinity for Islam, why the Quran is the source of discontent in many countries, and why the Obama foreign policy deception led to poor military action and caused the loss of American lives in Benghazi. Genix provides 36 questions for the Select Committee on Benghazi to validate if Americans are justified to mistrust President Obama and Hillary Clinton. An overview of Obama, Islam, and Benghazi is presented on the website www.futureofgodamen.com. That's www.futureofgodamen.com. Annie Callahan, dedicated to negotiating a position for Earth within the Daguerrean Coalition, had trained for 3 years to become an Earth ambassador. Yet, the very eve of her arrival at the capital ruling planet, she is claimed as destined mate to an oversized, mating-maddened vamp who swears he will never release her. Lord Aztaran, king of the Macian sector, has waited over 900 years for his destined mate. Having found her as an alpha vamp, he is unable to relinquish Annie, virtually holding her hostage until he can claim her. Yet Macians cannot survive without their mate's love. How could he strip her of her citizenship, her ambassadorship, and her freedom and expect to win her heart? With All That I Am by Kahira O'Donnell is the latest book in this exciting series, The Daguerrean Chronicles, guaranteed to keep readers coming back for more. With All That I Am by Kahira O'Donnell is available on Amazon.com and KahiraO'Donnell.com.
Welcome back. This is The Science of Magic, a place where magic and science come together to promote enlightenment. Visit us online at www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our guest this hour is Michele Rosenthal, author of Heal Your PTSD, Dynamic Strategies That Work. Her website is www.healmyptsd.com. Michele, Would you mind sharing with the listeners, it occurs to me that a lot of us could have been in PTSD for a lot of years and not really recognized it. Can you share with our listeners how they can tell if indeed that's what they're dealing with?
Oh, definitely, and that's a great point. I think the media has done a lot now to help us all understand that PTSD exists, and if someone's starting to think, I had a trauma and I've never been the same, there are very specific ways to start getting yourself on the right discovery track. So number one, the Heal My PTSD website actually has a self-test. It happens to be the self-test that I took that helped me get on the road to the right place. I knew there was something so not right about me, and I started researching trauma and dissociation because I lived in a very prolific state of dissociation often, and the research that I was reading led me straight to PTSD, and I thought, gosh, I've never heard of that. What is it? And I took this self-test, and we can't self-diagnose PTSD, but what this self-test does, and it can be found at healmyptsd.com/do I have PTSD, and there are you can just hit up the website and navigate to there. It's under PTSD info. But what's great about the test is it's designed based on the criteria for diagnosing PTSD. So it's 22 questions, and you can sort of assess yourself, and there's a score, a scoring explanation at the bottom of the test. And when you look at those 22 questions and see where you score, then you can say, okay, I really need to reach out. Like, for example, I took it to the therapist that I was working with, and I said, hey, let's take a look at this. What is this? And it actually prompted me to go find a trauma therapist, because I needed somebody who really understood trauma and what PTSD was, and that's how I eventually got my diagnosis. So I think the best thing to do is to start there and to start with some research about PTSD and what it is and what it looks like, so that you can start saying, well, yes, this describes me completely, and thank goodness, because now I know what the problem is. I can go find the solution. Or you can say, I have some of these experiences and some of these symptoms, but I'm not really PTSD. That's perfectly terrific too, because that lets you know, okay, you need some guidance to help resolve those issues, but it's not a full-fledged PTSD issue. So either way, I think the beauty of information in the self-test is that you get clarity on where you are, which helps you figure out what to do.
That's beautiful, because, so many people are suffering from these symptoms, and there are all these seemingly odd physical symptoms, but once we put it into the framework of, oh, I'm in fight or flight all the time, then we have something to work with. I've also noticed reoccurring negative patterns presenting in a person's life. For example, people suffering from PTSD due to abusive relationships, then they continually find themselves in abusive relationships. Have you noticed this? And if so, what do you recommend to do to overcome it?
I do notice that. I even saw that in myself. I was constantly putting myself in situations that caused me more medical trauma. It was ridiculous. And, Gwilda, it's such a great point that you're making, because I didn't notice what I was doing. I was always in more emergency medical situations, and I didn't even put it together until so much later. Holy cow, I keep creating more and more of these situations that are not as disastrous as my original trauma, but it's the same theme over and over. And I think a lot of us unconsciously do that. Living after a trauma, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it, because it's such an unconscious thing that we do. But in my experience, in my own recovery, and also with the many survivors that I've worked with, trauma becomes familiar. So this is one reason, I think, why that happens. Trauma becomes the thing that we know, and so we keep creating what feels familiar to us. So I think that's one reason. I think another reason is that we are living so much by default that we are not consciously making choices to change the way we live. So we keep accepting the wrong people or the wrong behavior, or in my case, mismanaging our health, because we just simply don't engage with the process of making change, because it's taking all of our energy, all of our capability, just to get up and make it through the day. there's nothing else that we can do. And so I think for those reasons, we keep creating that same situation over and over again. And actually Judith Herman talks about this too in her book, Trauma and Recovery. So it's documented that we all do that, and I think we all do it for different reasons, but it's a very common occurrence.
It is, and it's actually burnt pathways in the brain. You do the same thing in the same way, and pretty soon that becomes your default setting. How would you suggest people stop themselves before rerunning that loop?
I think the most important thing is to recognize not necessarily the loop, but the fear in which you're living. Because to me, at the base of all trauma recovery is we have got to recognize we live in fear. I'll share something with you, Gwilda. For let's see, it took me 25 years to be diagnosed, but for 24 of those years, it took me 25 years, to be diagnosed. So 24 of those years, I didn't even realize I lived in fear. It was such my natural state. I thought everyone woke up in the morning feeling terrified that today could be the day that they died or that something would go wrong. I thought everybody was like that. I never talked to anybody about what I was feeling, so I just assumed that was the way everybody woke up. So I think the first thing to do to move to a place of recovery is to recognize what your fear is and to be able to name the fear, whether that's consciously with language, or in an image, or through a song, or through art, or any way that it feels right to express it. But the fear is what needs to be transformed so that then we can break out of those habits. Because those habits come from a lack of safety, which is what you referenced at the beginning of the show. So it's really important to heal the sense of safety before we start trying to change anything else. Because making those changes is dependent on our feeling I'm okay. So that's what I would say to begin, is to recognize the fear, start ameliorating the fear. And then once you get a base of, I can relax a little bit. That doesn't mean you meditate an hour a day because you're so relaxed. It just means I can trust a little bit the moment that I'm in. Once you get there, you can start looking at what are the patterns that I'm in and how would I want to change them if I feel I can trust even just a little bit the moment that I'm in. And Heal Your PTSD, Dynamic Strategies at Work, is based on this concept. It's tons of tiny little strategies to make tiny little changes because I think it's too much to try to do everything at once. So all of the strategies in Heal Your PTSD are literally designed to help you make one small choice, one small action, so that you control and personalize your PTSD recovery and can approach each part of it on your own terms.
I like that. So can you address memory loss as it relates to PTSD?
Oh, sure. There are different types of memory loss. For example, we don't remember the actual event itself. The psyche is a phenomenal thing, and it will literally shut down and blank you out if there are moments it feels will overwhelm you. So one kind of memory loss is we just flat out don't remember the event at all. Other types of memory loss, short-term memory loss, which occurs for a lot of people. The brain is overstressed. We lack sleep. There are a slew of different reasons, but a lot of short-term memory loss happens for many PTSD survivors, which is also, another sidebar to that is a very difficult challenge in terms of concentration and focus. The brain isn't working optimally, and so memory loss happens frequently and is very frustrating. I know for myself, I had a really hard time studying in college. I couldn't remember anything that I read, and I would literally have to reread a paragraph until I just started writing I literally would write the textbook out because the only way I could try to remember something was if I wrote it and read it and wrote it and read it and wrote it and read it.
Wow.
So a lot of us deal with that, but there are ways to manage it.
We're going to have to take another break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about how does PTSD affect our family lives and our friends and our relationships. We'll be back on the flip side of this short break. You're listening to Science of Magic, the place where altruistic professionals of science and the esoteric create common ground for the betterment of our world. You can always listen to previous broadcasts on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Children aren't the only ones afraid of the dark. Millions of soldiers return from war zones with PTSD, anger, frustration, fear, and loneliness, much of which surfaces during the darkness of the night. You have the chance to change the lives of these American heroes. Songs and Stories for Soldiers.us provides free MP3 players for these men and women. With a list of 3 million songs in 16 different styles, 100,000 audiobooks, and 30,000 old-time radio programs, every veteran can find something to soothe and comfort them at no cost. All our players contain an 8-hour audio program designed to help veterans fall asleep. With 1,500 plus vets now participating, it's our goal to deliver 10,000 audio players this year. Go to our website at songsandstoriesforsoldiers.us. Help us help a veteran make it through the night.
I am Dr. Carl O'Helvey, founder, president of a new cancer foundation focusing on evidence-based physical, mental, and spiritual interventions, including natural cancer cures, prayer, meditation, affirmations, nutrition, and other related holistic cancer prevention and cure modalities. These are used in cancer education, research, and financing care. I ask for your help to continue this important work by donating at www.holisticcancerfoundation.com.
You're listening to the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. If you enjoy reading a good mystery with a touch of the paranormal, then you'll love From Out of the Woodwork by William S. Peckham. Sean Kennedy, a Toronto contractor, buys derelict houses, guts them, and turns them into multi-family dwellings. When Sean buys 29 Livery Lane, a century house in ruins, and starts the renovation, the house fights back. He is visited by ghosts of owners past. His visions are triggered by touching an oak mantle, reading a faded letter, opening an old locket, or opening a brand new casket in the basement. These visions will take you on a trip across southern Ontario from Niagara Falls to Toronto to Kingston. From Out of the Woodwork is now available in paperback and on your favorite electronic reader. To order your copy of From Out of the Woodwork, go to www.williamspeckham.com. That's www.williamspeckham.com.
Welcome back. This is the Science of Magic, bringing together gifted people of service to the world. Our website is www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our guest this hour is Michele Rosenthal, author of Heal Your PTSD, Dynamic Strategies That Work. Her website is www.healmyptsd.com. Michele, before we went into the break, I promised everybody that we would talk about how do you love somebody with PTSD? What advice do you have for families?
Oh, that's one of the toughest, most sticky problems. Let's start with, actually, I've thought about this so much and spoken about it so much that I designed an infographic about it. It's on the homepage of healmyptsd.com. It's called 10 Tips for How to Love Someone with PTSD, because this is one of the biggest problems that we have in the PTSD community. The strain that it puts on friendships, families, and relationships is enormous. With PTSD, we have aberrant behaviors. We are well, for one thing, we isolate a lot. And so family, friends, and relationships don't have the emotional connection that they may have been used to or they want. And we also have a hard time with change and so many other factors of just regular everyday life. So it's very hard for people to relate to and connect with us. So some ways that can ease that process, the number one thing is for friends, families, and relationships to do their own research. It's very hard for a PTSD survivor to communicate. PTSD and trauma literally interrupt the left frontal portion of the brain, which is where your language center is, and so it can be very hard to connect emotion and language in a thought process that creates a speech pattern. So with friends and family and relationships, the more they do their own research about PTSD, the more they will be able to understand the behaviors that they're seeing in their PTSD survivor loved one. That was actually the genesis of the Heal My PTSD website. I wanted people to understand, what is this? What does it look like? How does it manifest? And what can be done to heal it? Because it can be healed. And so the Heal My PTSD website is an educational resource more than anything else. So number one, do your research. Number two, be helpful, be accepting, surrender to this is the way my loved one is right now. How can I best still communicate with them? How can I best still spend meaningful time? I mean, I was so isolating all the time, and yet my mom still would call me and say, come on, just for 2 hours, let's go out and get lunch. Or just for an hour, let's go to a museum together. She was always, despite how often I pushed her away, and that's what we do, don't come near me, I don't want to deal with anybody, I don't want to be with anybody, my mom always found a way to reach me through there, and that took love and patience. So I think there's a lot that can be done to maintain those relationships, maybe on a truncated level, but to hold on to the connection while your loved one is struggling through finding themselves again, because ultimately this is so much of an identity issue. You're not the same person you were before. You can't go back to who you were before. You hate who you've become, this overly frightened person, and you don't know how to become the new you that would be more comfortable in the world. And so it's a process of finding ways to connect that are comfortable and having conversations about what that might look like.
That's really well put, because we aren't the same, and we never will be the same, but that doesn't mean we can't be better. Would you speak to that?
Absolutely. Holy cow, for sure, because I feel that so deeply. I see that in so many of the people that I work with. As a coach, I have been able to watch the exciting process of someone coming to me and saying, I haven't showered, I haven't gotten out of the bed in weeks, I watch the same movie all day, and when my husband comes home, I don't even say hello to him. And I said to this one client, I said, okay, well, let's start figuring out what to do. And a year and a half later, not only was she out of the bed, showered, and cooking dinner for the family again, she was back at work, and she was writing a novel, and she had transformed to someone way beyond who she'd ever been. And she was almost 50. She'd had PTSD since early childhood from abuse. So the change was so enormous, it was like she went from being who she had been molded into as a child of abuse to bursting out like a butterfly out of a cocoon into this person that she and I were very deliberate in crafting and creating. Who did she want to choose to be? Because before trauma, we all are born and we are programmed between the ages of 0 and 7 by the experiences we have and the environment that we're in, and then we continue to grow and discover ourselves, but oftentimes not consciously. We grow and experience and discover things and move on. We don't usually take time to reflect. But PTSD recovery, it forces us to really think about, who do I want to be? What kind of person do I want to be in the world? And when you are forced to reflect on that, you can create someone so incredibly vibrant and capable and full of life, which is even better than you may have ever been had you not had a trauma and been forced to think about making really specific choices.
You know, one of the shamanic precursors, in fact, some traditions actually create trauma to encourage the shamanic gift. But one of the precursors to having a shamanic gift is having a shattered life. Because once that life is shattered, we are open to receive all sorts of other kind of information. Creativity can come through. But the key is choosing, isn't it? Choosing to live your life in a different way.
It is, and I think that's the biggest gift of trauma. Is if we had to say there's a gift, nobody wants to have a trauma, big T or little t trauma. Nobody wants that. It doesn't feel good, and in most cases, for those of us with PTSD, it's just downright terrifying, and it rips you to pieces. However, you're right. A shamanic or other gift that comes out of trauma is the idea that, you've been offered a choice, and the tools to make the choice. And now it's up to you. And as hard as trauma recovery is, which I think, honestly, Gwilda, healing PTSD was worse than enduring my original trauma. And it is a grueling process, made easier by some of the new, I healed a long time ago, so we didn't have access to all the new things that we have now, but when we move through that process, at whatever level of difficulty it is for us, because there's no one way to heal PTSD, everybody has to find what process works for them. And when we move through that, we have attained the gift of self-creation.
I like that
amazing
concept a lot. Before we have to close, and we're getting close, Michele, would you mind telling our listeners where they can find your books?
Oh, absolutely. Any Barnes & Noble, on or offline, and the HealMyPTSD.com website has links to Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Powell's, all the different booksellers online, and you can also just walk into your regular on-location bookstore that there are less and less of, but still are my favorite locations for book buying. And you can always join us at HealMyPTSD.com, and we even have a free Heal My PTSD forum that is open 24/7, and anyone is welcome to pop in there and ask a question or relate an experience and just get support, because it's very lonely. Having PTSD is very lonely and isolating, and you're really not alone. There's an enormous number of us. The PTSD population is in the millions, so you are always less alone than you feel.
Michele, thank you so much for bringing your wisdom and your beautiful heart to the program. This has been The Science of Magic. Remember, you can always listen to past thought-provoking episodes on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net. Our guest this hour has been Michele. Her website is www.healmyptsd.com. Sounds like a wonderful resource. Until next time, dear ones, may you be blessed with knowledge, comforted with love on your sacred path to wholeness.